Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be here. It's an honor to be speaking at this conference in India, and getting to visit the school the other day was phenomenal, so I'm happy to be here. I've been instructed to stand in this red dot. I like to move when I talk, so we'll just see how this goes. Before I begin, what's not up here is that I need to just acknowledge some sources of federal funding that I have for research in this area and other areas. So I have federal grant from the Department of Education and one from the Department of Defense, both of which have supported a little bit of time that's gone into this. Probably as many of you know, most of what we know, thank you. I'm already forgetting things. This is not off to an auspicious start. Most of what we know about autism, about interventions that work, about assessments and so forth, comes from research on children with autism. In fact, when many people talk about autism, they're actually talking about kids with autism. But it turns out that children with autism, they grow into adults with autism, and we don't know a whole lot about supporting adults with autism, or even all that much about what it is that we should be doing to help children grow into adults who can be as independent as possible and participating in their community. In fact, some of the things that we do know about adults with autism, well, it's just not that great. So most of the research on adults with autism and other disabilities comes from the United States. So some of these statistics are based on the United States, but I have a feeling that the story is not dissimilar in other countries. We know, for example, that adults with autism, they have much more difficult time finding meaningful employment. Less than half of adults with autism have ever earned any money for working at all. If they do work, they earn minimal or no wages. They often work less than 20 hours a week, and they tend to have very little choice in what it is that they do. In the United States, people up until the age of 22 are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. And we talk about this thing that we call a services cliff in the United States, because that's as soon as somebody turns 21 or 22 and ages out of educational services, suddenly there's nothing available anymore. There's no more rights to any sorts of services, and so we call that the services cliff. I wondered a lot about why it is that the trajectory for adults with autism is so poor, and I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. Some of them are things that may be slower to change, and if we could change it all. So I think that there's a lot of prejudice and bias and misunderstandings about autism, and certainly that probably contributes to some of the difficulties that adults have. I like to focus my efforts on things that I feel like I can control. Some people may call me a control freak. I definitely don't think that's true at all. But I do like to focus on things that I have some control over. And so one of the areas that we've been looking at that might be related to some of the poorer outcomes for adults with autism actually starts with what it is that we do with children with autism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I should mention, by the way, that most of the things that I'm going to talk about today come from a series of conversations that I've had with a very good friend of mine and a phenomenal scholar by the name of Dr. Peter Gerhardt. And he's done a lot of work in this area and is just an amazing guy. One of the things that he pointed out to me years ago, and when I started looking for it, I found that it is true, is that in our work with young children with autism, we're certainly focusing on important things. We're addressing the core and associated deficits of autism, and we're doing those in effective ways. But if you go and watch in a classroom or in a home-based program or in a center, almost everything that we do with children is directed by an adult, which makes sense because we're teaching. This story continues, though, when we get to school-age children and adolescents. The focus starts to shift somewhat with adolescents. We start to focus more on academics and some functional skills. We often teach those skills in what I like to call isolation. So I might teach a child or a student to read the thermometer, but not in the context of anything else. And we'll come back and talk about why that might be a problem in a few minutes. All of these things, though, again, are really led by adults. So I want you to take a minute and think, if you can, about a program that you're familiar with, a classroom, a center, where there are children with autism, adolescents with autism. And I want you to imagine what would happen. So work with them. So in your brain, imagine that you're working with a child or children for several minutes. And I want you to imagine what would happen if periodically you moved out of the room. This is where I really want to move out of my circle, but I'm going to stand on the edge. What would happen if you moved out of the room? Well, Peter Gerhardt did this a few years ago now in several private schools in New York, in classrooms for adolescents with autism. Some of them were one-to-one classrooms, and some were small group instruction. And he put a little timer in the room, and he told the teachers, when the timer goes off, I'd like you to move away. And he recorded what the children did. What do you think the students with autism did when the adults who were leading the class moved away? Yes? You what? I'm sorry? He had the adults just move away. He had the adults just move out of the class, just not all the way out because that would be unsafe, but just to the edge of the room. So what did they do? Nothing. The students did nothing. They were not engaged. They were not talking to each other. They did nothing. I find this a little bit frightening. What this tells us is, again, almost everything that goes on in classrooms and programs for people with autism is led by adults. It's directed by adults. We also have a fair amount of research showing that for many, but not all people with autism, sometimes engagement in an activity goes on not because that activity itself is so fun, but actually by what we call negative reinforcement, which basically is a really fancy schmancy way of saying, I'm going to do what you want, so you stop bugging me. And so a child will follow an adult's instructions so that the adult, they might earn a break, and the child gets away from the adult for a little bit. If a student doesn't continue to engage in an activity when the adult who was prompting and leading the instruction goes away, that tells us that the skill might not be so valuable to the student, him or herself. So think for a second about how you allocate your time when you have a choice about what to do. So I'm not talking about all the things that we do because we have to, but the things that we do when we have free time. So I love to hike, I love to run, I read, I do other things too that we don't need to talk about now, like eating and things like that. But you can think about leisure activities. We have lots of things that we like to do. My son, he loves to read, he loves to play games on his iPad. He's ridiculously good at anything electronic like that. He likes to ride his bike, he likes to cook. If you think about it, for most of us, and for children too, many of the things that we like to do, they depend, at least in part, on skills that were taught to us by an adult or that we learned in school. I love to cook. Cooking would be difficult if I couldn't read and if I didn't know basic math. So that's great, but we continue to do these skills because they pay off for us in some way. I don't cook because somebody's making me cook now. I cook because I enjoy it. I enjoy the act of cooking, and I really enjoy that chocolate cake when it comes out of the oven. Sometimes, not when it's not good. But I continue to do things because they pay off for us. So I want you to stop and think for a second. What if everything that we taught a student with autism paid off for them in it, and that they liked to do it, it was fun for them, or it resulted in something meaningful to them in their world. So they continued to engage in these behaviors because it was valuable to them, not because it was valuable to you or to her or to him, but because it was valuable to them. Just one more thing that I've been thinking about sometimes. This is not quite set up right, but that's okay. I used a Mac when I made this, and we're going to have numerous Mac to PC transition issues, and this is the first one. So think for a second. I might teach a child that this picture, it's a very strange picture, it means escalator. I've watched so many kids when we teach something like this, and then they go into, say, an airport or someplace where there's an escalator, and they want to go upstairs, and there's a sign pointing, but they have no idea that that sign actually means there's an escalator. Or a student who, and you probably all know, may have seen this, where we can teach that this label means poison, but there are so many children, and especially children with autism, who will see that on a bottle but still pick it up and try to drink the pretty green liquid. Or know that this means bathroom, but see a sign in a shopping area and not know where the bathroom is. or see a signed dog and not know what it means. So I think my basic message is that you might use really great teaching strategies and you might be able to teach a lot of skills, but if the skill you're teaching is the wrong skill, it doesn't really matter. It's no better than using a terrible teaching strategy. So my main message today is we really want to be targeting more of what we call adaptive behavior with even young children with autism. This is a definition of adaptive behavior that I quite like. And so the definition says, adaptive behavior is anything that lets an individual meet standards for independence and responsibility, just like we would expect from a neurotypical person. We also think about adaptive behavior as being the performance of somebody who doesn't have disabilities, and we also know that adaptive behavior is not set in stone. So what's adaptive for a 3-year-old in the United States is not adaptive for a 15-year-old in the United States, might not necessarily be adaptive for a 15-year-old in India. So for a long time, when I was starting out in this field, I'm embarrassed to admit that I thought that adaptive behavior was pretty much equivalent with daily living skills. I thought that things like eating and using the bathroom and such, that was adaptive behavior. And it is true that all daily living skills are adaptive behavior, but there's a heck of a lot more that makes up adaptive behavior than just daily living skills. And these skills can be both simple, like, folding a napkin, and more complicated, like social interaction. Having a reciprocal interaction with somebody is so complicated. It's where you're looking, it's what you're saying, it's how close you're standing. There's so many things that are involved. We also turns out that not all adaptive behavior is something that people like to do. For example, going to the dentist is adaptive behavior. I don't know very many people who look forward to visiting the dentist. But there are other things that are highly adaptive. And I have up here playing video games because I have a lot of parents tell me, well, I don't want my child to play video games or be on screen. And you know, it turns out that most neurotypical, in the United States, neurotypical adolescent teenage boys in particular, they spend a lot of time on screens. They spend a lot of time playing video games. And if we have a teen with autism, it might be useful for him to be able to do those things too. It might be adaptive for him to be able to engage in those same sorts of things that his peers do. There's also, I think, some confusion about what the difference is between academic behavior and adaptive behavior. And so I mentioned earlier that in the United States, a lot of schools spend a lot of time teaching academic behavior. And that's great, but it's not the end. So academic behavior is being able to read a sign. Adaptive behavior is following the instructions on a sign. Academic behavior might be recognizing an emotion from a picture card. Adaptive behavior is changing the way you behave in an interaction with somebody based on that person's emotional expression. So there's a big difference between academic behavior and adaptive behavior. Which one is more important? Well, I don't know about you, but I know some people who maybe aren't the most brilliant people, but they are really competent people. They have good adaptive behavior, and they're doing fine. On the other hand, I know some people who are really, really, really smart, and they don't have very good adaptive behavior, and they're really struggling. So I think if I were going to put my eggs in one basket, I would put my eggs in the adaptive behavior basket. That's a very American expression. Do you all put eggs in baskets here? Is that it? So a message, I think, is address adaptive behavior and start early. Dr. Lord talked about this yesterday. She talked about targeting communication from a very early age. Communication is one of the most important foundational types of adaptive behavior there is. We want to target that early, but we want to target other sorts of adaptive behavior too. There's a tool called the Essentials for Living. I don't know if anybody in here is familiar with the Essentials for Living. It's an assessment that was developed to help to figure out what sorts of adaptive skills to teach individuals with disabilities more generally, and also autism in particular. And it walks through skills in different areas, from very simple foundational skills, essential skills, if you will, up to more complicated skills. And these are some examples of what you might regard as essential skills for anybody with autism to be successful, to be able to be as independent as possible. So one basic skill in the area of communication is that we want every individual to at least be able to request what they want, to request their wants and needs and indicate their interests. These are some important ones. Anybody in here that's a parent understands how important it is that we teach children how to have some of these basic skills. We all teach our children these things. It's important for people with autism to be able to wait, because sometimes you have to wait, to be able to transition from one thing to the next, to take turns. Listening skills are important also, particularly in the area of health and following safety instructions, like don't run out in the road, for example. There's a ton of daily living skills that are very important. These are a few that we might prioritize as the most important. I have up there being able to use the bathroom independently, eat and drink. We know that people with disabilities, and autism in particular, are at an increased risk for sexual abuse and physical abuse. The more that we can have children transition into adults who are independent in daily living skills, the less likely they are to be victims of abuse or neglect. So these skills are super important. And the last area are tolerating skills. And there's a lot of, and tolerating means being able to put up with. I might not like somebody standing really close to me and talking loudly in my ear, but I'm going to tolerate it because it's a socially appropriate thing to do. So we want to teach toleration. Is that a word? It is now. Tolerating skills. I just made a new word. We want to teach tolerating skills, being able to tolerate basic medical procedures, being able to tolerate being at the table, and so forth. And I should say, these things apply to people who have mobility restrictions too. When we're talking about somebody who has mobility issues, for example, being able to eat independently might not be feeding myself, but it might be tolerating somebody else feeding me. So these apply regardless of somebody's motor skills and different abilities. One of the things that I talk a lot about with our staff at May Institute is how to figure out what to teach. And we talk about the first thing should be that we want to teach skills that are going to help a person become independent as possible in a variety of skill areas. We also want to make sure that that skill is going to actually be used. Because if it's not used and it doesn't pay off for the person, it's not going to continue. And then we also talk about how long it's going to take to teach a skill. So maybe Save wants to learn to, or Save's parents want him to learn to text message. But it's going to take a year to teach him to independently type out messages on a phone. That's a really long amount of time to devote to one specific thing. So we like to think about all of these things together. The one caveat to whether the skill will be used frequently is safety skills. So safety skills would be things like not getting in the car with somebody you don't know. I hope that that's not a skill that someone will use frequently, but we sure do want that skill to be in their repertoire. So when there's skills that are really important, like safety skills, or leaving a building when there's a fire, what we do is that we practice. We set up opportunities to practice, and then we make sure that doing the right behavior pays off. So I would like my son not to get in the car with a stranger because it's dangerous, and I would like him to stay safe. I've taught him not to touch guns in people's houses. It's a big thing in the United States because they're really dangerous. He gets the no car thing. He's a 10-year-old boy. He's fascinated with weapons, all things weapons. He's kind of into guns, so I've had to set up all these sorts of contingencies about all the horrible things that will happen to him if I ever hear that he touches a gun. And we practice. We do all these really nice things when he doesn't do those things. So you want to set up situations like that so you continue to make sure that skills are practiced and pay off. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about how to teach. When we think about how to teach skills, we know a fair amount about the best ways to teach. And one of the best ways to teach a skill is to think about where it's ultimately going to happen, and to the extent possible, teach that skill in the context where it's actually going to happen. So this would be, this is a non-example of that, because I don't know about in India, but in the United States, people typically don't sit on a rug with their friends and brush their teeth. We tend to do it in the bathroom. And so when we teach skills, especially with people with autism, out of context, we talk about a problem of generalization, which is another really fancy way of saying, I learned how to do that sitting on a rug, and I can't quite figure out how to do it in the bathroom. So to the extent that you can teach the skill in the setting where it's going to be used, using the actual materials. So I've also seen people have these like big pretend toothbrushes, really fun, but not what somebody's actually going to use. And so we want to teach in context. Another important thing to think about is what we call rate of instruction. And what that means is how many times you need to repeat, somebody needs to practice to learn a skill. We know that for many people with autism, people need a lot of trials to master a skill. So for example, imagine a child who at 7 took 1,000 trials to learn letters. So now let's say that Manish is a teenager and his teacher is working with him, or his mother is working with him on learning how to order independently in a restaurant. If he goes to a restaurant once a week, which I see people do a lot, to practice ordering, if it took him 1,000 trials to learn his letters, how long do you think it's going to take him to learn to independently order off a menu if he gets once a week? Well, assuming it takes only 1,000 trials, it's going to take him 15 years. I think it probably will take longer because ordering off a menu independently is a much more complex skill. And yet, we do this all the time with adolescents and young adults with autism. We go into the community once a week. And then we wonder why people don't become independent. So I think that in this case, our failure is not necessarily, but this failure to learn to order independently may not be because of a deficit related to autism, but maybe due to our own error that we didn't teach with sufficient intensity for Manish to learn in the first place. Another area that we consider a lot is efficiency. Efficiency is a fancy way of saying, how hard is it? Teach a skill in the easiest way possible. I've watched so many times teachers of students with autism insist that they learn to write with a pencil, even though a child might have significant fine motor difficulties, and here, well, everybody needs to do that. Well, it turns out everybody doesn't need to do that, and there are much easier ways for some people to be able to record things, like maybe you could use voice recording, or you could type on a computer. So you want to think about response effort, how hard something is. Different things are easier or harder for different people. I personally like to write still, probably because I learned those skills before computers. That's easier for me. For other people, typing on a computer is easier. Think about teaching someone to use a phone to communicate, to text. There's lots of ways to do that. Some seem harder, some seem easier, but again, different people are going to find different things easier or harder. For some people, it might be using video chat. Others might find that really hard. Some students might prefer to type. You want to pick the modality that has the least effort, because frankly, all of us are a little bit lazy at heart, and we're going to do things in the easiest way possible. Another thing to think about is, this is really a technical way of talking about it, transfer and control. What that basically means is if you've taught in one setting, or with you as the person directing it, you want to spend some time thinking about how the heck you're going to help that student learn to do the behavior in the right setting, in the right context. Sometimes we want to do this to the environment. So I might teach someone to read and recognize signs, but what I actually want is the sign to control the student's behavior. So when the student sees this sign, I don't want him to go, danger, high voltage, keep out, and try to go in. I want him to read the sign and follow it. Self-management, I think, is an area where we have not spent nearly enough time with people with autism. Self-management means being able to figure out what I want to do, figure out what it's going to take to do it, and persist while I do it. We should be teaching self-management skills, teaching control of ourselves, not control of each other, but teaching a person with autism how to manage their own behavior, emotional regulation, and all those sorts of things. That sort of looks like President Obama meditating. Now that I look at it, kind of cool. Okay. We also want to think about value, and I've touched on this a couple of times because I think it's incredibly important. We want to teach skills that are valued to the person, not necessarily valuable to you or valuable to me, but valuable to the student with autism. Skills that they prefer, like my son playing video games, or that have functional utility, like my son knows now that he should really wear clothes when he goes outside. Those are the skills that are going to maintain. Other skills that don't have those kind of things, that aren't valued or useful for the person, we can still teach them, but I can tell you that it's going to be a lot harder. Many people will say that individuals with autism often struggle to generalize skills. I've heard this, I've read this, and here's just some examples of it. So we have students in our own school who, especially when they're prompted to do so, they'll say hello when they see somebody. And then, this happens all the time where I'll see a student and he'll say hello, and 3 minutes later I'll see him again and he'll say, hello, how are you? And 5 minutes later he'll see me again, hello, how are you? And I see some head nods, yes. And what people say is, well, that's autism. Maybe it's autism, but these same students, I know, and this one individual I'm thinking of in particular, he can figure out how to use any electronic thing in about 5 minutes, especially gaming systems, but really anything. I can hand him an iPad that I can't figure out how to do something on, he's got it. And I would say that that's generalization. So why is he not able to generalize greetings, but he does great with all these electronics? Well, it could be a neurological challenge, but there's lots of other things that could be going on too. Like maybe we are teaching greetings out of context. Like, is really the most appropriate way to teach a greeting in a hallway when I walk down and the teacher says, say hi to Dr. Cynthia? I don't know, maybe not. Maybe we're not providing enough teaching opportunities. So again, the example that I showed you earlier where somebody goes to a restaurant once a week. Maybe our problem is that we're teaching skills that are actually too hard relative to how valuable it is to a person. So maybe somebody's parent wants a child to learn to text message, but they want them to be able to type. Well, that's a hard skill for a lot of people, and it might not really pay off for them. And last but not least, maybe we haven't done a very good job of taking the greeting out of the control of the teacher, say hi to Dr. Cynthia, and turning it over to what the natural cues are, like the first time you see somebody in the day, but not 5 minutes later. Maybe again 3 hours later, but not a half hour later. So maybe it's not autism, maybe it's that we're just not teaching in quite the right way. So this is a little matrix that I use sometimes to help people think about this. And so you have a vertical axis where we have effort, and effort is how hard something is, and then on the horizontal axis is how valuable a skill is to a person. So we know that, for example, if a skill doesn't take much effort, but it's also not valuable, you're probably going to be able to teach it. Like I can teach somebody to touch cards that are red, green, or yellow, but if that doesn't have any big value, it's probably not going to generalize outside of the teaching context. I might teach something that's really hard, but is very valuable. It's going to take me longer to teach it, but because it's so valuable, once that skill is learned, it's probably going to maintain. Similarly, if I teach something that's really hard and has no value, probably not going to be learned, and it's certainly not going to maintain. And this corner, that's the sweet spot. That's where you want to be. So you want to spend as much effort as you can thinking about how to make something easy as possible, and pay off as much as possible. And to the extent that you're able to do that, you're going to get rapid acquisition, and you're going to get it to maintain and generalize. So that's where we should be. We should be spending lots of time thinking about how to do that. So sometimes people say, well, does that mean I just shouldn't teach something that a person doesn't want to do? Well, if that were true, my son would probably still be running around naked, because when he was little, he didn't really value clothes. I valued clothes. I valued him wearing clothes. So when you have a situation like this, where there's a skill that's important, but you want someone to learn it, what we want to do is you need to think about how to make it pay off. It's not paying off naturally, but you want it to pay off for them. So you want to think about what you can do after the behavior that's valuable so it continues. I hear a lot reinforcement doesn't work. Like, well, I gave him a reinforcer and he threw it. Well, then it's probably not a reinforcer. So for example, I really love pakoras. I actually love all the food here, but but let's use pakoras. So let's say you said, Cynthia, every time you raise your hand, I'll give you a bite of pakora. I'd be like this. But probably after the 5th, heck, maybe the 10th pakora, I might stop raising my hand. Why? Because I'm tired of them. I'm full. It's not that I don't like them, it's that I've satiated. So reinforcement works, but we have to be creative in how we use it. So in summary, if you're thinking about how to help somebody transition to adulthood and to be as successful as possible, think about teaching adaptive behavior. Target those most essential skills first, the things that are going to help them be as independent as possible, and make sure that not only are you using evidence-based teaching, but you're teaching in the context that is where the skill is going to be used. You're providing enough opportunities to practice, and be sure that skill pays off for the person. Thank you.